We are going to do a pre-season service on this 2002 Polaris 550 fan. We'll clean the carburetors, check and adjust the track if necessary, check the Hyfax and scaggs, grease the suspension, and just go over all the components on the snowmobile to make sure it won't give us any trouble this winter. First thing we're going to do is remove and clean the carburetors. We'll start by getting the belt guard out of the way and removing the top of the airbox. On this model you can't remove the airbox totally because it's part of the oil tank as well. It's just too much work and not really necessary either. So next we need to disconnect the fuel lines, the air lines, the choke plungers, and the throttle. Start by unscrewing the throttles. Remove the fuel line. The air line or vent line, and then a 12mm to undo the choke. You have one oil line on this side as well to remove. Always careful with that. And all that's left is the clamp holding the carburetor on. Now these are Mikuni round slide carburetors found on most of the older snowmobiles. And like many, they have a little hose on the bottom, and that's a water trap. It's a good thing to empty those yearly too as you're cleaning your carburetors, because water is heavier than fuel and will settle in the bottom of that. Now we're going to remove the second carburetor in the same fashion as the first. Might be a little more easy to see on this one. This choke is just, the bolt is just brass, so when you put that back in, don't over tighten it. They've been known to break. Clamp for the fuel line. Vent line. And the oil line. Quite a few carburetors do not have an oil line running to them like this one does. Most of the time it runs right into the oil line runs right into the motor. the clamp, and then this one's done. Some snowmobiles run what they call staggered jetting, where the jets on the 2 different carburetors or 3 different carburetors on triple will be different sizes. So it's important to put the carburetors back together with the same components that came out of them and put them in the same spot on the snowmobile that they came off of. Now this snowmobile does not have staggered jetting, so it's not as important. What we'll start by is removing the float bowl. I've also taken these over to the parts washer a few minutes ago just to give the outside a quick cleaning. Don't want any of the dirt from the outside getting in them. Kind of defeat the purpose. Now this snowmobile gets its yearly service. Gets put away in the spring properly with fuel stabilizer. I do not expect these carburetors to be dirty at all, but a little preventative maintenance never hurt. And like I said earlier, just draining the water traps, taking them apart to do that is worth it. Which you've already done now. I've put it upside down. Yeah, and the inside of the float bowl is clean, but I will rinse that out. And the carburetor itself does look good. I will pull out the pilot jet, being careful. Go. The pilot jet has a very small hole in it. We'll spray some carburetor cleaner through it, some compressed air, take a look through it, make sure it's nice and clear. I just hold it up to the light usually to look through it to see. You'll be able to see if it's blocked or not. This one's wide open, but I will still use the compressed air. Now if you're going to blow air through this, you're going to want to hang on to it fairly tightly. You don't want it to go shooting across the room on you. You might want to hold up the light again, have a look. Yep, looks good. Next we'll do the main jet. 6mm on this one. A washer as well. And same thing, you can see right through it. I want to hold up to the light, make sure it's not plugged at all. Blow some cleaner through it. Compressed air. Yep, perfectly clean. Now with the carburetors being this clean, I really don't need to take the needle and seat out, but I'll take the float arm off and the needle out just to show you what it looks like. Just push that pin in a little, and you'll be able to grab it from the other side and pull that out. Lift up on the float lever, and there is your needle valve right here. That's what shuts the fuel flow off to the carburetor. If these are bad, your snowmobile will flood, hard to start, The older XLTs were famous for that. To get the seat out, all you do is you unscrew this here. And you can replace that. They're $35 or something a side or a carburetor for the new style ones. Now I'm just going to put some compressed air through this again and we'll put it back together. Don't forget the washer. And again, these are brass, so not real tight. Now, if you have a snowmobile that doesn't like to idle, or after it's been running a few minutes, it idles really high and you have to hit the choke to bring the idle down. That's usually a lean condition. A lot of time that is because the pilot jet is partially blocked or could even be too small. Oops. After you have the screws out of the float bowl, and if the float bowl is stuck to the carburetor a little bit, the trick is just to lift it up by the float bowl. Give it a couple taps and it usually comes right apart. You want to be gentle, that way you don't have to replace the gaskets. They are reusable as long as you don't rip them. Alright, both carburetors are now clean and ready to reinstall. And this here is that oil, where the oil line goes, as I was referring to earlier. Now most of the carburetors don't have that. Now we'll reinstall the carburetors in the reverse order of how we remove them. Make sure they're in all the way, seated. Make sure they're square to the snowmobile. We don't want them on an angle. While we had the carburetors off, we also took a look at the carb boots. Make sure they're not weathered or cracked or checked. The ethanol and the fuel doesn't always get along with the rubber and plastics in your fuel system. So always keep an eye on that. Make sure the lines are still in good shape. All the rubber and stuff still in good shape. If there was cracks, you'd get an air leak, your snowmobile would run lean, and good chance you'd blow up the motor. Fuel line is now on and working on the oil line. Choke back in, making sure it's clean. Tighten that up in a second. Throttle down. This only goes one way. It's got a groove in it. That groove goes against a notch in the carburetor. Make sure it slides down. If it doesn't, when you start it, it'll be wide open throttle. You don't want that. There we go. Well, the carburetors have been reinstalled. The throttle slide, the cap on that, I hand tighten those. I tighten them as tight as I can get them by hand. You don't want them coming off and loosening off on you either. But you don't really need to put a wrench or a pair of pliers on them to get them any tighter than by hand. Now, when we had the carburetors off, we didn't make any adjustments on any of the cables. So we should still be perfectly fine the way they were. None of the carburetor settings have been adjusted or changed. But just while we have it apart, we might as well take a quick look. Make sure we have just a tiny bit of play in each choke cable. Just feel it move just a hair. That's enough. Now the throttle itself, what I always like to do is open them up. Get it for the throttle valve is just to the top of the carburetor where you can feel it. Make sure both are at the same spot. That way you know the cables are adjusted evenly. And they are. And then if you can see inside, as you press the carburetor throttle, make sure they both start to move at the exact same time. And you'll know it's set pretty close to accurate. And they are. You can also use a drill bit as a feeler gauge in the carburetors to make sure that both of the slides are in the same spot. Now, if these carburetors are extremely dirty or were from a snowmobile that's been sitting for a few years, I would have totally disassembled them and soaked them in the Chem Dip carburetor cleaner. That stuff's kind of nasty though. I don't like to use it unless we have to. But all the rubber and plastic parts would have to come out of the carburetor. It has to be totally disassembled. Just the metal parts can go in there. It will basically eat anything else. Soak it for a few hours or overnight for extremely dirty carburetors. Clean them up in the parts cleaner. Reassemble and it'll be like new. So next we're going to grease the chassis and the suspension of the snowmobile. I use the Polaris Premium All Seasons grease just because I have it. I bought a bunch of it from a dealer that went out a few years ago for for half price. But you can use any grease you prefer. Now, there's two grease fittings here. One's on the jack shaft and one's on the drive shaft. The drive shaft you can get at without removing the secondary clutch, but the one on the jack shafts, you have to remove the secondary clutch. So what we'll do is we'll remove the belt, remove the secondary clutch, and grease both those fittings. Now to remove the belt, I just put the parking brake on, roll the clutch back, push the belt down a little, and it will come off relatively easy. So I was able to open the clutch up a little, push the belt down. That should give me enough room to pull it off now. Enough slack in the belt. Alright, so now with the belt out of the way, the parking brake's still on, we'll remove the bolt, 13 mil. So it holds the driven clutch or the secondary clutch on. There'll be washers on this. Make sure they go back in the same way they come off. Washers, spacers. That should slide right out, and there'll be a key. Woodruff key. There's one of the spacers. Alright. There's spacers in behind as well. Make sure they go on or stay on the same way they come off. You don't want to make any adjustment there. A couple pumps of grease in each fitting. Now, the bearings on the other side of these shafts, they'll get lubed up from the oil in the chain case. Now, one other thing I always do is put a little grease on the jack shaft. You don't ever want that secondary clutch to stick on there and not come off. And it is made with a little bit of play in it, for it will slide back and forth to keep your belt aligned nicely. At least on this model it is. Reinstall the driven clutch. And there's the key I was talking about, the Woodruff key. Line that back up. There we go. Spacers in the same order. And I'm going to use a little bit of blue thread lock on the bolt that holds the secondary clutch in. The blue is not a strong Loctite. You can still get it out without heat, as I just did. But just a little extra insurance that it won't come out when you don't want it to. And that's it. Well, I've reinstalled the belt, and they say the belt should always spin in the same direction. So what I always do is I always put it on so I can read the name and the numbers, so that's, you know, it's facing me. That way, you know, the belt's always going to go on the same way. Now there's two grease fittings on the outside of each front suspension. We'll give them a couple shots each. And I usually stop once I can hear it coming out. And same with the bottom one. And that's it. So we'll do the same with the other side and we'll be done on the front. I also have a little white lithium grease. I like to spray on all the heim joints and rod ends. Just a bit. So next we're going to grease the rear skid, and there's 5 grease fittings in the skid. Next, we're going to check the bearings on the wheels, check the track alignment, and check the Hyfax for wear. I'm going to check the bearings. All I do is pull the track down a little bit, give the wheels a spin, see how the bearings sound, wiggle the wheel back and forth. These seem pretty good. Do that to all of them in the suspension. And then take a look at the Hyfax. Don't know if the camera will pick it up or not, but there's a line right along here, which is a wear line, that will show you when you need to replace it. They're not hard to replace. There's only 2 bolts that hold them in, one on each. And if you can slide them right out through the track windows. Not impossible to do. Next, we'll have a look at the chain case. I've changed the chain case oil on this last year, and we only rode it a few times, so I'm not going to do it again this year. There is a drain plug on the bottom of the chain case that you can access from underneath, and then you just fill it through the dipstick hole until it's up on the dipstick to the appropriate level. The dipstick also has a magnet on it, so if you have any debris in your chain case, it will stick to the magnet. But we're going to just check the level today, and it's right in the safe zone, so we're good there. Next, we're going to inspect the scaggs, or carbide runners, under the ski. These have only got 1 year on them, and like I said, not a lot of miles, so they're still in decent shape. The carbide is all there. The bars aren't wore thin, so they will go another season or 2. Now, if the runners or scaggs needed to be replaced, that's pretty simple too. On this model, there's 3 bolts holding them on. Just remove the 3 bolts, pry down the back, and they'll come right off. This is the carbide scagg that was on it last year that I replaced, and as you can see, the carbide is wore down considerably. Not as sharp as it used to be. Another thing I like to do on the snowmobiles that are a few years old is take a look at the fuel line inside the tank, the pickup line. Make sure it's still connected to the fitting. Make sure it hasn't come off. The ethanol in the fuel today doesn't do these any favors. I've found many with the fuel line have to come off the fitting. It'll only run when you have half a tank or better of fuel in it, and you won't be able to figure out why. This one looks decent. It has already been replaced once, actually. And next we'll be installing the battery. So most people keep these in their basement or their garage over the summer and on a trickle charger. I use the same battery in the ATV in the summer as I do in the snowmobile in the winter. Just swap it out from one to the other. We're about ready to fire this snowmobile up for the first time this season. To make it a little easier, what I'm going to do is I'll take the spark plugs out, put a little bit of gas down each cylinder and reinstall the plugs. Just helps it start a little quicker. I am expecting the snowmobile to smoke quite a bit when it's first started because we did fog it in the springtime with quite a bit of fogging oil. So what I've done is I poured an ounce or 2 of gas in the lid from an old spray can. Now I can squeeze it and use it like a funnel to pour a little bit of gas down each cylinder just to make it easier to start. If you don't have electric start, this is really the way to go. So make sure your aim's good, and if you spill any, make sure you wipe it up. Alright, we're ready to fire it up. See how it goes. the rest of the fogging oil out of it, let it run for a few minutes to clean it out. We'll replace the spark plugs. Other than that, a quick wash and wax and we're done. Hope you enjoyed the video.